Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I'm here with another video for the Three Rivers Challenge. This is the pantry challenge that I do every January and February here on YouTube and on Instagram, and other people join me, and we all use the hashtag Three Rivers Challenge to share how we are avoiding the grocery store and preparing meals for our families just using what we have in our food storage. So that includes all of the things we canned from last year's garden, all of our homegrown meats and protein sources that are in the freezer, and any other store-bought goods, maybe bulk grains and things that we purchase that we kind of want to cycle through and use up because, things do have a shelf life. And so doing a pantry challenge is always a wonderful opportunity to kind of assess your food storage situation, how much you're canning every year, how much you're purchasing from the store, and you can decide what you're purchasing maybe too much of, and you can scale back on that, or maybe what you don't keep enough of in your house. So I love that. I'm also starting my garden planning. I sat down last week and kind of mapped out this year's garden, and doing this pantry challenge has shown me where some of the holes are in what we grew last year. And so in my garden planning, I'm making sure to start seeds for some of those vegetables that I'm really missing right now and wish that I would have preserved more of. So we have a month down. It's been a crazy month for us here because I had a baby on January 6th. So that really made this a crazy month for us. But we still committed to doing the pantry challenge and only cooking from our food storage. So I'm happy with the progress we've made. We ran out of a lot of the store-bought convenient stuff, like for me in particular, all-purpose flour. It's not something I always purchase for my family, but I did purchase some for the month of December because I knew at the end of the pregnancy I was just going to need a little bit of convenience. And what I had purchased for December lasted me through the first couple weeks of January. So now that we're out of that, I'm now relying on a lot of my bulk grains, and I'm grinding my own flour using my grain mill. So you'll see a lot of that in this week's video. And I'm loving that because a lot of those grains need to be cycled through if they're not stored downstairs in Mylar. If I just have them in 5-gallon buckets, I want to make sure I'm using those things up. So this has been a really good opportunity for that. This week, so besides me being 3 weeks postpartum, my children, I have 9 children now, all of the older 8 got norovirus over last weekend, and it lasted through the beginning of the week for a few of the children. And if you're not aware of what that pleasant, lovely virus is, it is a gastrointestinal bug. This is, believe it or not, the very first time in almost 18 years of parenting for me that we have ever dealt with any kind of GI bug or stomach flu or anything like that. So we have been very blessed that, first of all, my kids very rarely get sick, but when they do, it always seems to be more colds and respiratory illness. We have never dealt with this situation before, and it was not pleasant. We had 8 children all getting sick at the same time. Praise the Lord that Adam and I and baby Abigail stayed healthy. We're praying that that remains, that we still remain healthy in the coming weeks, because I know there is a contagious period of a couple weeks with norovirus. But anyways, my point in bringing this up was that we had some varying appetites in the house, which affected my meals that I made this week. I made a plan, and then we were not able to stick with it because the majority of the house was not in the mood for solid foods. They wanted broth and liquids and things like that. A couple of the kids couldn't even really eat or keep anything down for a couple days. And so I did not do a lot of cooking in the beginning of the week because there was no sense in making big meals when it would just create a bunch of leftovers that we would have to eat up. So I'm bringing to you in this video the things that I was able to make this week and some of the treats and things that were helping us get through a very unpleasant week here in our house. But praise the Lord, all of the children are healthy now. So if they look a little sick and green at the gills in this video, that is because they are dealing with a very nasty bug. So, all right, let's go ahead and show the meals for this week. The first thing I want to bring you in this video is a little treat that I've been making myself pretty much daily. I don't drink coffee, but I have needed a little pick-me-up because this cute little angel here has been keeping me awake through a lot of the night. And so as a caffeinated treat, I've been making myself a lot of dairy-free hot cocoa. So let me show you how I make my dairy-free milk first. I'm starting with some bulk cashews here. These are not soaked, but if I do soak them overnight, I feel like I do get a better texture in the milk. I just wasn't prepared on this day, so I didn't soak them. And to that, I'm adding a little bit of cacao powder. I don't really measure. It's probably like between 1 to 2 tablespoons. And then to sweeten it, I am using dates. So just pitting my dates here. These are one of my favorite ways to sweeten without having to rely on sugar or other sweeteners. And it makes a really tasty dairy-free milk. And then to that, I just add a little bit of vanilla extract. Fill my little blender the rest of the way with water, and then we're going to blend this together until all of those cashews sort of disappear. But we will have some cashew chunks in there, so I just use a little strainer to strain those out, and I can save those cashews to add to muffins or something. And then I put the liquid on the stove to heat up and melt down that cacao powder and make it chocolatey. And now I'm going to make my marshmallow fluff. I'm starting with 1 cup of warm water, and to that I add 3 tablespoons of beef gelatin. I get my gelatin in bulk from Azure Standard. There's a link to Azure Standard in the video description, but you could use any kind of gelatin, even like Knox gelatin that you can get from the grocery store would work great. You just want to make sure that you allow that to disintegrate in your hot water fully. If you get a gritty texture in your marshmallow fluff, it's because your gelatin didn't fully disintegrate into your liquid. Now I'm using the whisk attachment on my Bosch mixer here, and I'm going to add my sweetener to my marshmallow fluff. I like to use either maple syrup or honey. I think maple syrup gives the greatest taste, and I use between a half a cup to 1 cup of any kind of liquid sweetener. So if you don't want to use maple syrup or honey, you could use corn syrup or agave syrup, date syrup, anything like that. But we typically use maple syrup in our house. And then I add a little bit of vanilla extract or peppermint extract if you want it to be a minty marshmallow flavor. And you just keep whipping it. It can take up to 10 minutes to get it to that nice whipped up marshmallow fluff texture. Now this recipe does make quite a bit. You're probably going to have extra if you're just making it for yourself. This amount will feed all of my children in one sitting, but if I'm just making it for myself, I will put the extras in the fridge. It will change textures and get kind of more like a jello texture, but it melts up just fine once you add your hot cocoa to it, and it gets nice and frothy and melty. And so this is what I've been making myself from the pantry pretty much every day to kind of caffeinate and wake myself up in the mornings so that I can do everything I need to do to take care of my family. My task for this week was to take our storage apples. These were out in our overflow fridge in the garage, but when the temperatures dropped last week, we pulled them inside just to keep them from freezing. And we had done about 6 bushels of apples in the fall, and in a video I showed you guys how we stored these, and they had been out in the fridge and we've eaten most of them. This 1 bushel of bags is what we have left, and you can see that some of them are looking a little rough and some of the varieties still look wonderful. So I went through this week and I pulled out all of the apples that are great for fresh eating, and I put them in the drawer in the fridge in the house, and then all of them that are looking a little rough were turned into applesauce. We stored 5 different varieties of apples this past fall to get us through the winter, and many of them did great, but this Gold Rush variety did not store very well at all. This is probably the apple that went soft the fastest, and you can see that they are looking very rough. They taste amazing. They're a super sour apple, but I would not save these for storage ever again. They're much better for fresh eating. So I washed them up really well, and I'm just going to chop these up, and we're going to make a batch of applesauce to eat as a snack this week. The rest of the apples that were looking a little rough, I put into a big batch, and I canned it up and added those to the pantry. So just going to chop these up. I'm going to add a little bit of water to my pot to prevent the apples from sticking as they begin to cook down on the stove, and that water will evaporate as it cooks. And then once they started to soften up, I can take my immersion blender and blend those apples down. I made this a chunky batch of applesauce, added a little bit of cinnamon, and stirred that up. And then this made a wonderful snack for the children on a cold winter day. So, like I said, I canned up the rest of it because we're trying to eat the fresh apples up before we really dig into a lot of the applesauce. And once we finish up the rest of those fresh apples, we'll start eating the canned applesauce. Now to a meal. So in last week's video, one of the last dinners that I made was a crock pot barbecued rib using my home canned apple barbecue sauce. Well, whenever I make those ribs and I have the leftover drippings from the ribs and all of that wonderful barbecue sauce and little shreds of meat that are left over in the crock pot, I never want to waste that. And I find the perfect use for it is in some beans. It makes a lovely barbecued pork beans. So that's what I'm going to make for lunch on this day. I chopped up a homegrown onion and I'm chopping up some garlic. And we're going to get that on the stove with a little bit of our beef tallow that we rendered up last week. And we're just going to get that browned on the stove so that we can then add our barbecued rib drippings to it to make the most delicious beans. Do not waste those drippings. I know they look kind of nasty, but there's amazing flavor. This jar right here is like a flavor bomb of all of the rich lard that would have been from those ribs, as well as all of that wonderful barbecue sauce flavor. And then there are some meat chunks in it. So now that my onions and garlic are done, I'm just scooping out all of the leftovers from the crock pot in there, and we're just going to kind of melt that fat down. I am going to have to take a knife and kind of chop up any of the meat bits that are rather large in there. And then we're going to add our beans to that. Super easy lunch. This was an amazing lunch on this day, and it kept me from wasting all of that yummy flavor that was in the bottom of the crock pot from that rib meal. I added a little bit of salt and pepper, and then we continued to cook that down. Now to serve these beans, since they were kind of liquidy, I did cook a little bit of rice, and that is how we decided to eat it. So just a little bit of rice in the bowl, and then add a little bit of the barbecued bean mixture. And I have to tell you, this one tasted wonderful. But I get a lot of questions from you guys about, do my kids always want to eat everything that I make? And I'll tell you, my older children are extremely adventurous. David is telling me how much he's enjoying this. They pretty much love anything that I cook. But you can see that the little ones sometimes have a hard time. This is Benjamin, my son, who's 4, and he was not excited about this lunch. And my goal is to try to train my children to be the kind of kids that will not judge food by how it looks, but to judge it by how it tastes. So sometimes some of my meals aren't the most attractive, but once I start feeding the little ones and they taste it and they realize this is actually really yummy, then they will finish their food. And that's just what I often have to do to get them to eat their food. I find that if you have picky toddlers, if you take the time to sit down and feed them, sometimes that really does make a difference. So Benjamin here did end up finishing all of his beans and rice, and in the end, he said it was pretty good. So that is what I do for my picky little ones. Now we're going to make a breakfast here. I was craving something sweet on this morning, and I can't have grains like wheat and things like that, but I can have buckwheat. So I had this roasted buckwheat in the pantry, and I decided to run it through my grain mill to make a buckwheat flour. It saves you a ton of money if you have a grain mill. If I bought buckwheat flour in the store, it would be so expensive compared to grinding it myself. We are going to make some buckwheat pancakes for breakfast because buckwheat is actually not a grain. So this is something that I can have on the diet that I use to control my Crohn's disease. So I am starting out, I didn't have a mixing bowl this day. If you're wondering, why am I doing this in the most inefficient way possible? I grabbed a jar because it's the only big container I had to mix up my batter here. So I started out with 5 cups of the buckwheat flour, and to that I'm adding my baking powder. I did 5 teaspoons. So for every cup of buckwheat flour that I use 1 teaspoon of baking powder. I added a couple teaspoons of salt, and then I'm mixing all of those dry ingredients together. To that, I added 1 cup of avocado oil. You could use any kind of liquid fat. And then I'm going to add 5 cups of liquid. I'm just adding water. You could add milk or some kind of nut milk. You could even do juice. I've done apple juice in this before, and it's really delicious as well. Just any kind of liquid, same ratio of flour to liquid. Adding a little bit of vanilla extract to that, and then we're also going to need to add some eggs. So I added about 4 eggs, and then I'm going to use my immersion blender to get that all blended up. Now, if you've never made buckwheat waffles or pancakes, the batter on this is different than a traditional wheat-based pancake batter. It's kind of like gummy almost. That's how I would describe it, but that is normal if you're wondering. And so we're just going to start flipping our pancakes. You're probably wondering why I'm flipping these one at a time for a large family, and that is just because kids were kind of coming down one at a time. Some of them were sleeping in, and so I just kind of take my time in the morning and do what I need to do in the kitchen and flip them one at a time so that they're warm for each kid as they come in and eat. If I did a bunch of pancakes at once, they would just kind of sit there and get cold. You're also probably wondering in this video why I'm always in my robe, and that's because I'm 3 weeks postpartum and kind of living in my PJs a lot of days. The baby isn't really giving me time at this point to get dressed and ready every single day. So I am in my robe because it's also winter and very cold. So postpartum moms, you do what you have to do, and I am trying to stay comfortable, and being in my PJs is part of that right now. So this is what our buckwheat pancakes look like. They are absolutely delicious, and like I said, I'm pretty tired in the mornings lately, so I just needed something sweet as a pick-me-up. I was craving these pancakes, and they really hit the spot. So this is a great alternative if you're a gluten-free family. Try to make some buckwheat pancakes sometime. I find that the texture of these often turns out better than if I use like an all-purpose gluten-free flour or something. I much prefer the texture of a buckwheat pancake to that. So the little ones sure loved these. And so now we're going to move on to the next thing that we made. And this was kind of a treat. It's a treat that I made a lot for the kids this week while they were sick, and that is homemade Jello. So we have some of the citrus that's left from the bulk order that I showed you last week. I decided to juice up enough for a batch of freshly squeezed grapefruit juice. I figured the kids could use a little extra vitamin C as they're on the mend from their illness. It's so funny that on the week that they were eating large amounts of fresh vitamin C, they still got sick. So I haven't quite figured out how that happened. But we are straining our grapefruit juice through here to get all of the pulp out because we do not want the pulp in our Jello. That would give kind of a strange texture. So there's our quart of juice. So that's going to be our cold juice when I make the Jello. We need to have some warm juice to dissolve our gelatin into. So I'm straining out 1 quart of my home canned, this is cranberry pomegranate juice. I think I canned this with you guys last fall. And since it's already canned juice that was heated up, I don't mind heating it up again. I didn't want to heat the grapefruit juice up because that would destroy a lot of the vitamin C in it. Vitamin C is one of those vitamins that actually does get completely destroyed if it is heated too high. So we're going to scoop out 1 whole cup of the bulk gelatin that we have into the juice that we're going to heat up. As we stir that right the first time, it's going to kind of dissolve into the room temperature juice straight out of the jar, and it's going to get really thick. A really strange thick texture. Then we're going to put it on the stove and it's going to melt down into a liquid texture. First thing I'm going to do though is pour half of the jar into each of my dishes here. I didn't have a clean large baking dish, so we're just going to do 2 small ones. And in the meantime, there's that thick cranberry pomegranate gelatin mixture that is just super thick, and I don't want to bring it to a boil because then it would be so hot that it would heat up the grapefruit juice. I'm just literally heating it to the point that it begins to melt the gelatin so that I don't have clumpy gelatin in my Jello, and then I'm going to stir that into the cold juice mixture. We're going to get that all stirred up so there's no clumps of anything in it. And then we're going to put that in the fridge. And it really doesn't take long for it to solidify, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And it is solid. And you can cut it up like this. Sometimes I'll put it into little gummies, little gummy shapes. But today I just decided to make squares of gelatin, and I figured the kids were extremely dehydrated from their sickness, so I made them a lot of gelatin this week just because it's a solid they can eat that's gentle on the stomach, that then gives them a lot of liquid as it hits the body. It starts to melt down, and it's essentially like drinking juice. I didn't add any sugar to that because the juice was sweet enough and they didn't need the sugar as they're getting over their sickness. Now we're making another kind of healing meal here, something that was gentle on tummies. I have 1 quart here of a chicken soup base. This was just chicken and a couple veggies like celery and carrots, onion, garlic, bay leaves, parsley, all of the flavorings that you would put into a chicken soup. I added a little bit of extra water to my pan with that. I'm pulling out the bay leaf that was in the canning jar and decided to add 1 extra bag here. I get these from Aldi. Aldi has the best price on organic frozen mixed vegetables. Just going to put 1 bag of that in there, and we are going to add a little bit of arrowroot powder, maybe only like 1/3 of a cup. We don't need a bunch, but that arrowroot powder is going to end up thickening the broth that's down in there into somewhat of a gravy. For this lunch, I decided to make a chicken shepherd's pie. I know that with lamb it's called a shepherd's pie. With beef it's a cottage pie. Is there a name for a chicken version of this? I don't know. Are we going to call it like a farmhouse pie or something? I guess that's what we'll go with, a farmhouse pie. Adding a little bit of salt and pepper to that. And we're going to get that on the stove, and as it heats up, that arrowroot powder will thicken it into a gravy, just like cornstarch or flour would. And in the meantime, I had some potatoes boiling on the stove so that we can cover the top of this in mashed potatoes. I just poured our chicken and veggie mixture out into a baking dish, and now it is time to work on our potatoes. So dairy-free mashed potatoes are something that a lot of people probably think aren't going to taste good. What do you do if you don't have milk or butter to add to your mashed potatoes? If we had bacon grease in the house, that's what I would add. That makes the best mashed potatoes. But we don't have any right now, so I'm just adding a little bit of avocado oil, and I add salt and pepper. A lot of times if I have garlic salt, I'll add that. And really all you need is a little bit of fat from the oil. You could use beef tallow or lard or whatever, but bacon grease usually makes the best. And we just put that in there in place of butter, and it does a good job. I am sprinkling in a little bit of parsley as well. And then I like to take my immersion blender if I left the peels on my potatoes and kind of hit the potatoes with that to blend in those peels so that we don't have any large pieces. And then I'm just going to scoop my mashed potatoes out on top of the chicken mixture. We're going to put it back in the oven on 350 degrees and let it bake just until the everything gets all nice and bubbly. Added a little bit of salt, extra salt and pepper to the top of it before we threw it in the oven. And this is one of those meals, kind of like the beans and rice earlier, that doesn't necessarily look the prettiest, but it's one of those that just tastes amazing. And I knew that my kids would enjoy this. It's just something gentle with the potatoes and the chicken and the broth and stuff on their bellies as they were recovering from their sickness. So this is what it looked like in the bowls, and the kids ate it up. They absolutely loved it. Now we're going to get into some recipes using freshly ground wheat. If you aren't someone who grinds their own wheat, it definitely is a whole different beast from baking with traditional store-bought all-purpose flour that is pre-ground. The texture of the flour is entirely different because the bran and the germ is in the flour, and most traditional recipes do not work. And I do have to say, I'm not an expert in baking with the whole grain freshly ground flour. I'm still learning, but it's something I love doing because I feel like every time you bake with it, things get a little better. So on this day, I am experimenting with my 30-minute roll recipe. This is one that I've done many times for you with pre-ground flour. Today I'm going to make it with the freshly ground, and we're going to see how it turns out. So the first thing you're going to do is start with your water. We want to have warm water. I used 2.5 cups of warm water. To that I added 1 cup of avocado oil and 1/2 cup of honey. I'm using the honey to sweeten this. You could use sugar or any other sweetener that you like. I just think that honey gives a really good flavor to these rolls, and I've been giving my kids enough sugar in other baked treats, so I thought I would use up honey instead. We're going to run out of sugar very soon. So to that, I'm adding our yeast, and we're going to do 4 tablespoons of yeast. That seems like a lot, but this is a large recipe for a large family. I'm hoping to make these rolls once and be able to use them for at least 2 to 3 meals. So we set that yeast mixture aside and let it activate. Then we added our eggs to it. We're going to add about the equivalent of 1 tablespoon of salt. And now it's going to be time to add that flour that we were just grinding. This recipe calls for 10.5 cups of flour. So that, sounds like a lot. It is a lot. So because the freshly ground flour works differently, I didn't add all of the flour in the beginning. What I do is I put it in the mixer and let it start kneading, and I slowly add flour to it as it's going to get it to the right texture. And then I let that machine knead it for a really long time. It was like probably 10 minutes because I want to get the gluten activated in there. And then I'm adding just a little bit of extra flour to my dough here so that it isn't sticky at all while I roll it out into my little dough balls. So the texture of this turned out wonderful on this day. I've baked with the whole grain flour before, and sometimes the texture isn't super light and fluffy, but on this day it turned out pretty wonderful. So I'm pleased with this. This is a recipe that I would make again with this flour. I feel like it worked out great. So just rolling out my dough balls here. I have my oven preheated to 350 degrees, and then we're going to get these baking there until they're done. It usually takes about maybe 10 to 12 minutes. And this is what they looked like. We did let them rise for about 5 minutes before we put them into the oven. And I decided to do an egg wash so that they would brown. I don't always do an egg wash because it just feels like an unnecessary step sometimes. But since I was making these for my son's birthday, I thought I would make them extra special and pretty just for him. So this is what they looked like when they came out of the oven. They turned out lovely. And when you are eating with the whole grain flour like this, the texture is often a lot more dense, but it's still delicious, and you have all of the nutrition then of the whole wheat berry instead of just the white flour, which is wonderful. I've got my helper here on the counter as usual, and she just needed a little pacification so that I could get through the rest of dinner prep on this day. So as I mentioned, I had made those rolls for my son's birthday. He wanted chili and rolls for his birthday dinner, but that was the next day. So I made the rolls the day before, and I decided to use the rolls to make sloppy joes on this night. So here I had put 3 pounds of beef and chopped up some peppers with my home canned sloppy joe mix. We don't like our sloppy joe super wet and messy, or I guess I don't like it super wet and messy because then it's really hard to clean up after the children. As a side dish to serve with this, I just grabbed a bag or two of these convenient potatoes. I get these from Azure Standard also, and I just needed something quick on this day, and I thought these potatoes would be good for some of the kids whose bellies need the potatoes. And just put some oil in that cast iron pan, throw the potatoes on there, and let them cook up. This was just another super easy meal to make. Always goes over well. My kids love sloppy joes, and who doesn't like potatoes? So now baby is happy, so I can get on to serving dinner to all of her siblings. This is what it looked like plated up. Most of the kids had two. Some of the older kids came back and had a third. I just eat the meat mixture over top of the potatoes since I can't have the rolls. And everybody is happy. Now we're going to move on to another breakfast. I love grinding my wheat berries early in the morning. I wait until I'm ready for all the children to wake up because the noise of it serves as kind of an alarm clock for all of the children upstairs. They know that when that grain mill is going, Mom is starting breakfast and it is time to wake up. So we got our flour all ground up for our breakfast on this day, and I decided to make some applesauce muffins. I've made this recipe for you guys before, but not yet this year on the Pantry Challenge. So we're going to start with our flour here, and I am doing about between 3 and 4 cups of the freshly ground flour, and I did 1 cup of sugar. Then we're going to add our baking powder, just 2 teaspoons of that. We're also going to add 1 teaspoon of cinnamon and 1 teaspoon of nutmeg. Then we're going to add our salt, just 1 teaspoon of salt. Those are all of our dry ingredients that we're going to get mixed together. Now it's time to add all of our wet ingredients. So as I mentioned, this is called applesauce loaf, so we're going to need to add some applesauce. I am adding 2 cups to this recipe, just using a jar that I had in the fridge. And next we're going to add our olive oil or avocado oil or melted butter, whatever fat that you would want to use in this. To that we're adding 4 eggs, and then we're just going to get that mixed up. Now I usually make this as a loaf, like a bread, and then I glaze it, but to save time on this morning, I decided to just put it in some muffin cups and put it in the oven and bake it that way because I knew that the muffins would cook up faster. Usually the loaf will take, 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how thick the center of it is, whereas these muffins would only take about 20 to 25 minutes. So we needed a protein to serve with that, and I found a package of Canadian bacon in the freezer. So with our muffins here, we had 2 dozen muffins. We have our Canadian bacon, and I chopped up some fresh navel oranges, and that was our breakfast on this morning, and I think everybody was pretty pleased with that. Next thing we're going to do is make a birthday cake for my son David. So I don't want to use whole grain flour. I want fluffier flour for a cake. So I'm going to use the sifter attachment that goes on my Bosch mixer. And what I do is I put the freshly ground flour in the top, if I can get the lid on, and then I turn the mixer on and it sifts all of the bran and the germ out of that flour, and then all of the fluffy white, almost what you would buy as an all-purpose flour in the store, that falls through to the bottom. So we don't throw that bran away. It can be saved for bran muffins. We can use it in our mealworm farm, or it can make chicken food, and I'll just feed it to them. So lots of options there. We have our wonderful white all-purpose flour. We're going to start making our cake. So I started with 2 cups of sugar. To that I added 1 tablespoon of baking powder, and then I added 3 cups of that sifted flour. To that I added 1 cup of avocado oil, 4 eggs, and we're going to add 1 cup of almond milk. You could use any kind of liquid in this, and we're going to add a little bit of vanilla extract. Get that all mixed together, and that is my standard birthday cake that I make all the time for the children. It's just really easy. I can whip this cake up in literally like 20-25 minutes. So it's a really easy recipe. We just need to get our little pans out to save time. Sometimes I'll just pour it into a big like 11 by 13 baking dish and bake it that way. But David is my resident baker who usually makes really fancy cakes for everybody else in the family. So I thought it would be really nice in making his cake to take the time and a little extra effort to make it a little prettier. So I baked it in the round baking dishes,
And this is what they looked like. Now, like I said, David is the resident baker, not me. So this isn't going to be the prettiest cake. I'm going to do my best and try to make some frosting. So to make dairy-free frosting, I use palm fruit shortening. We get that in our mixer with the whisk attachment. And then I add about equal parts of palm fruit shortening to powdered sugar. And then we flavor it with whatever kind of extract we want. I'm doing a vanilla cake, so I added vanilla extract. I've done all sorts of different extracts on that frosting, and this is what it looks like after about 10 minutes or so in the mixer. I'm doing my best here. I should have gotten out David's cake decorating stand that turns, but I just decided not to, and I did my best. It's not the prettiest, but it will get the job done, and it is made with love, and that is what counts. So I'm so proud of my newly 16-year-old little David. He is such a blessing, such a wonderful son. I'm so proud of him. So, on to another task this week to clear out the freezer. We just had 2 heifers butchered in December, and we have a ton of soup bones in the freezer taking up space. So I decided to fill the bottom of my electric roaster with a lot of those soup bones, and we are going to can up some broth. So grab some storage carrots. I washed my onions, and I'm putting a couple homegrown onions in there with the onion skins and all. I washed garlic, and I'm doing the same, just leaving them in the skins because that won't hurt our broth. It'll just add more flavor. I'm going to add a whole jar of freeze-dried homegrown celery greens from last year's garden, and also some of our homegrown freeze-dried rosemary just to use up that jar. It'll be perfect in the broth. Going to add some peppercorns. Then I'm going to add some bay leaves. You can never have enough bay leaves in your broth for flavor. It's so yummy. And then we're going to add our salt. Now, typically to broth, I would add a little bit of apple cider vinegar to pull out the minerals from the bones. I don't have any upstairs, and I didn't want to go down to the cellar, so I'm just going to add some lemons, and the acid from those lemons will serve the same purpose as the vinegar. And then we just need to fill our roaster up the rest of the way with water. I'm going to turn the roaster on a low, usually between 200 225 degrees or so. I just let it sit for about 18 hours, and then we can start filling up our canning jars. So I am going to can this batch. My pressure canner holds 7 quarts, but I ended up with another 3 quarts that went into the fridge that we'll use for meals in the next week. But even in a pantry challenge, we're still adding food to the pantry because I need to get things out of the freezer and get them shelf stable. So we're filling up our jars here, and then we are going to need to wipe the rims of those jars because that is super greasy. As you can see, I didn't skim off the fat. I never do when I'm canning broth. I prefer to have the fat in my broth. And then we're going to add our 4 jars canning lids. If you would like 10% off your canning lids, check out the link in the video description and use my code, and you can get a great deal on the most amazing canning lids that I've found. They have the best seal rate out of any that I have used. We're going to get our rings on, and we're going to process these in the pressure canner for 25 minutes for quarts. And then I wanted to show you the ones that I put in the fridge. This is how they gelled up. That's what you want in your broth. You want to have a really nice gel like that. That gelatin is what is so healing about the broth. And my kids sure needed healing broth this week after the sickness that we were dealing with. So after those quart jars processed for 25 minutes and the canner cooled down, then we could get the jars out of the canner and get them sealing. So that is what we were up to this week. Those are the meals that I was able to record for you guys in between taking care of my sick children. And we're just enjoying Little Miss Abby. I hope you enjoyed the footage of what we were up to in our kitchen this week.
Okay, friends, that is it for this week. We're going to be back next week with another meals video. And I hope you guys will join us then. I had plans this past week to publish my birth video. It's all filmed and edited, but when I uploaded it to YouTube, the video and the audio was not syncing together. So I've tried a couple things and it didn't fix the issue. So until I get that fixed, I'm just going to have to wait on that. So hopefully next week I can bring that to you and also bring you another meals video. So I hope you guys, until then, have a wonderful week and stay warm and healthy out there, friends. All right, we'll see you later.